Well, I have to start by telling you something about myself, and I also have to start by making you laugh at least a little bit. And the laughter's for me, so I'm not nervous. It's peculiar to me to imagine that I'm delivering a sermon. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you my religious background. My mother did everything she could to turn me into a good Presbyterian. And I did go to Presbyterian Bible School for about 2 years and liked some of it, really liked the youth minister, but I think it's genetic. I think by age 10 or 11 I realized I didn't believe it. I couldn't be literal. The stories I was being told, some of them just didn't add up for me, and I was in conflict with that. And when I was about 12, when I was about Condi's age, my mother said, we're going to Easter service. And I told her very honestly, Mom, I do not feel good. And she said, we're going to Easter service. So we went, and we were about 10 minutes in, and I threw up all over the back of the man who was seated in front of me. And that gave me credibility. So I really had been sick. I wasn't faking it, and I never went back to church. And my formal religious education ended there. And maybe to my detriment, but that's where it ended. Since then, there are a couple of traditions I've enjoyed. I have enjoyed the Buddhist tradition very much. I think there's so much wisdom there. I used to go with a friend to the very, very beautiful Quaker services in La Jolla. I have great respect for Quakers. And I think this is my 4th or 5th Unitarian visit. And you all are so kind, and you have such great values. You may suck us in. We'll see. But I'm very honored to be here. It's very, very nice to be asked. So that's my religious background, and now I want to tell you briefly about the art background. If I do have a religion, and I think my family would agree with this, I'm a visual art-atarian. From a very, very early age, I was drawing and cartooning, loved visual arts. In college, it was the thing that I absolutely had to do. And to be more serious for a moment, I just think that visual art was this very, very rich source that offered me the information I really wanted about people and history and beauty and the things that fill you up, that are part of your spiritual education. And I felt like I could come to art on my own terms, and it has been so rewarding and so beautiful to me. And so that's the way I come to you, as a visual art Unitarian. So a wonderful experience I had before retiring. For 7 years, I was a visual arts blogger for the Huffington Post. And I had no idea how social writing would be. I met so many people over time especially, and I had followers on social media, and social media really was social. And toward maybe the last year I was blogging, I put up a question on Facebook. I asked visual artists, tell me about empathy. Tell me what about empathy in your own artwork, and what's the value of empathy. And from their comments and a little bit of research, I wrote a blog about empathy. And that is the topic. That's where the topic for today's talk came from. So I want to read you the opening of the blog that goes with this image. This is an image by the extremely powerful German artist Kathe Kollwitz. And I'm going to start with a quote from her. "It is my duty to voice the sufferings of people, the sufferings that never end and are as big as mountains." The great German artist, printmaker, and sculptor Kathe Kollwitz knew profound personal suffering. After her younger son Peter died in battle in Flanders in October 1914, she fell into a deep depression that reshaped both her art and her political views. The double sculpture that she finally completed in 1931 for the cemetery where her son was buried, and you're looking at that sculpture, shows the artist and her husband kneeling in grief. When asked about the sculpture's theme, Kollwitz explained that it was about much more than grief. It also represented all the parents of her generation asking forgiveness for having led their sons into war. The grieving parents, like so many of Kollwitz's finest works, is grounded in empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. And I want to take a minute and go away from this and just say, think about the monuments that you've seen. especially military monuments and monuments in military cemeteries, they generally deal with heroism or glory or victory or transcendence. This is very different. This is a monument that asks for an apology, which is remarkable. And it also opens up the topic of shared grief. Other parents who had lost sons in this war could empathize with Kathe Kollwitz and her husband. So the empathy, the image, she offered that to people as a shared experience in her artwork. Kollwitz recognized that she was expressing something greater than her own feelings, and that her art could only function if it served an entire society. Grief and loss are universal feelings that bind us, and sharing them with others leads to consolation and social transformation. It's not surprising that in 1936, so 5 years after this was put in place at the cemetery, the Nazi Party barred Kollwitz from displaying her works and branded them as degenerate. Deep feelings for the sufferings and losses of others, which lead to collective introspection, can lead to resistance against authoritarian politicians and those who advocate war and other forms of sacrifice and suffering. So that is the power of that work, which is so magnificent. And I'm going to try and not be emotional, but it's hard, right? That's my religion, is visual artitarianism. But I'm pulling it together, okay? Let's go ahead. So now what I want to show you, I have kind of a brief lesson. And, I'm a retired teacher. I can't not teach you. But I have a brief lesson on empathy in visual art. And then the last 10 images are contemporary artists who have an aspect of empathy in their practice and in their artwork. When I look at this northern painting, this Jan van Eyck picture of Christ enthroned, it shows you one way that art functioned before empathy in art, right? The idea of a religious figure, Christ as a king, very much like a Byzantine king. And I used to tell my students the Byzantine Empire was the most conservative, Western political structure, so much so that one emperor actually reigned as a corpse for 6 months while they waited. They would ask the corpse questions. So it's authoritarianism portrayed in art. It's a magnificent painting, but it's very, very different from some of the other images that evolved of Christ as a suffering figure. And you've taken art history. I'm sure you know that a big part of Western art was sainthood and the suffering of saints. And I think I want to make the point here, I don't know to what extent you can empathize with the suffering Christ of Grunwald. It was very extreme. It was made for a monastery, Antonite monastery, where they treated people for skin diseases. I think that's what informed the painting. But it does take you into suffering. It certainly does that, but maybe it offers a suggestion that Christ suffered for you, so it also displaces it. The earliest painting I could think of that had a form of empathy had it in kind of a sideways way. This is 1512. This picture of St. Jerome shows the saint meditating in the wilderness, and you can probably see what he's doing. He's taking a thorn out of the lion's paw. And I agree with the thought you're having. It doesn't look at all like a lion. I don't think Pat Muir had seen a lion. Anyways, but it has this kind of proverb. It has this idea that your enemy is in pain, which is why they might attack you. And if you would remove the pain, your enemy would not attack. And that's a moral teaching. And maybe the animal is there to represent that kind of empathy for your enemy. But I really think, for me, empathy begins with Rembrandt. Because Rembrandt was so generous in the humanity of his artwork, and in his self-portraits, or in this, he did Christian and Jewish faith-based images. In The Prodigal Son, you feel the father's hands on the back of his son who has come home after screwing up so many times. And it's not great, but you can see that the son who stayed home and did what the father wanted, looking on somewhat jealous. But there's so much feeling in Rembrandt, and I think you can begin to find the empathy here. And I'm going to point out, empathy in art has mainly been on the Protestant side of the equation. I think it came late to Catholicism because Catholicism was more of a different kind of power structure, right? The second quote you had this morning, the second reading, was about confrontation in art. And confrontation to develop empathy begins with Goya, who witnessed some of the events when the Napoleonic troops slaughtered Spaniards in Madrid in 1813, I think it was. And in this painting, the 3rd of May, you can kind of divide it down the middle, and there's two statements here. On the one hand, you really see and are terrified by and can empathize with the man who's about to die. He's facing his own execution. That's the moment. And others have been executed ahead of him. Others, one of whom is sucking his thumb, right? Realizes they're next in line to be executed. So it's this profound thing. How do you feel for these people and with these people who are facing their death? And then the other thing that's so interesting is look at the executioners. They're all in uniform. They're all have their back to you. They've all been dehumanized. And Goya makes the point that when you carry out something like this, you are dehumanized. So I think we really see we're moving towards what I call expressionism or even social realism. Paintings that are not about supporting power, paintings that aren't about telling you rules or how to conform, but paintings that really bring you the human experience. You may know that Van Gogh was the son of a minister and wanted to be a minister, also did union work for poor coal workers in Belgium. When he made his potato eaters, he told his friends he wanted people to smell the potatoes when you looked at the painting. And this was a whole new class of people making their way into art. This isn't just kings and queens and saints and mythological Greek gods and goddesses. Now you can be there at the meal with this family. It's a last supper for working people, you might say. Edvard Munch, like Van Gogh, was just seen as being extreme or nuts, when he painted at the end of the 19th century. But what a breakthrough he made in feeling. And The Scream is, of course, his most famous painting. But I just love his paintings that are about people and relationships. And here you can see far away the woman in white and the suitor she's chosen over the man in the foreground. And Munch painted these tremendous emotions, jealousy, melancholy, grief. And he painted them in such a direct way that I think you can look at this figure in the foreground and you can feel that. You can be there, you can empathize with that figure. And in Rodin, modern art really blossomed in terms of empathy. Rodin made this figure group, the Burghers of Calais, and it is the leaders of a French city. They've been conquered by the British, and they're going to be executed. So it's Goya all over again. But each of them in their posture, in their gesture, in their faces, are contemplating their fate. And it's so human, right? It's not monumental. Well, it is monumental, but you are just so taken into their individual reactions and their humanity. All right, let's do contemporary. So I have 10 contemporary images, and I have both confrontational images and I have gentle images. So they're all types are here. Fernando Botero is a leading artist in Colombia, kind of known because his figures are all like dirigibles. They're all a little bit blown up. But he was absolutely outraged by Abu Ghraib, by the photos that came out of there, and responded to that in a very, very large outpouring and suite of paintings. And what can I say? He's confrontational. He puts it right in front of you. What is this? What's this mean? What's the implication of this? Why is anyone involved in this? Wonderful artist working in Los Angeles now is John Sansini. His subject for years has been day laborers. And here's what he does. He goes down to Home Depot or he goes down to Sepulveda or Pico, and he hires day laborers not to bring up his rose bushes, but to pose in his studio. And he pays them a good rate. And he has done, painting after painting that just simply says, here are some people looking for work in California. I present them to you. And he's not sentimental. He's not maybe even making a judgment about them or who they are. He simply says, they have their suitcases and they're looking for work. What's your take on that? And I think it's lovely the way he honors their labor by paying them. He makes a lot of friends, and it's a very friendly atmosphere around his studio. Sando Burke, I must say more like Goya, confrontational, did this kind of mural-sized painting of the Battle of Stonewall. He calls it, in 1969, the Stonewall Riots. And it's another painting that it pits power against people, and it makes you ask, why? And, what's the importance? Why do we need to revisit it? What's the humanity that's involved here? And this is what in the 19th century they would have called a history painting. But history paintings are still being made in the 21st century that ask us to question our actions and our values and to think about humanity. Another gay-themed artist is Jean-Paul Malotzi, who has done a wonderful series just about masculinity. And I think it applies for gay men, it applies for straight men. It's just simply, how do we connect? What are the emotions we share? How do we get along? And he's got a really cool idea, which is that emotion becomes the abstraction in his paintings. And it kind of is like this electrical charge that connects you. How do we connect to each other? How are these men connected? How do you feel about that? Brings up themes of loneliness and meaning and caring. Bo Bartlett, in this wonderful painting about Halloween. Bo Bartlett gets so many levels in his paintings. And I think one that this is about being different. Halloween, everybody's in a lineup, everybody's in their costumes. So it's a masquerade, first of all. And then one child stands on the center line and looks out at you. And I will share with you that Bo lost a son to drug abuse. And I think that this painting maybe has his memories, but the premonition of that and a sense of difference. And there's danger in standing on the yellow line, right? We tell your kids, be careful when you cross the road. I was just telling Condi that. But this is a painting where the humanity of it and the feeling of children tells you a story and makes you think. David Lenz is a wonderful artist who has worked with, his son is special. Son has special needs. So this portrait of his son won a National Gallery portrait contest some years ago, and he's gone on to do a lot of portraits of kids that have disabilities and are special. And looks like Cambria, doesn't it? But they live out on a farm, and that is his son's perfect world. And it's the place where his son doesn't have to feel anything other than it's beautiful and I love it here, which is what kids should feel. Kerry James Marshall grew up in LA, and I think the big question he had all the way through art school into his 20s is, how come all the people in the paintings are white? And 99.9% of them are, except for Rubens' studio assistant, right? There's a lot of white in the museums. So he has gone back and recast portraiture in black, and by the way, ivory black right out of the tube. There's no compromise on color. And so he's done a whole series of scouts and scoutmasters that make you kind of think back to Norman Rockwell and wonder a little bit. And then he can be confrontational too. And I saw his show at MoCA in Los Angeles. He did a series called Heirlooms, where he posted blow-ups of lynching pictures. I don't know if you know that Marion, Indiana was the site of the last documented, I'll put that in air quotes, lynching in the United States in 1930, also the hometown of James Dean. But he took a photo, and he was really struck by the people turning away in the foreground, especially by the women who were not looking. He felt that was a form of collusion in what was happening. So he used the sentimental tradition of an heirloom or a locket, and he put their faces into their lockets. So it transforms the locket and the cameo from being something sentimental to being something else, an accusation or even a burden. So he turned that around and asked us the why of that history. Vincent Desiderio has a young son, actually his son's at his 20s now, that has had horrible medical crises out through his life. And so Vincent has painted kind of the waiting and the watching and the being up all night of his son's situation. And wow, does he paint it in a beautiful way. I mean, isn't it the power of art? You can paint something very, very difficult. You can make it very, very beautiful, too. In September, David Casson has a show opening at the Fisher Museum in USC. In fact, I'll put in a plug. September 17th, it opens. He is painting survivors because he realizes how precious they are and that they are, they're leaving us. The generation is going. So this is the most recent painting he just did of a man by the name of Ed Mossberg. And he has had survivors, when it's available, put back on their camp clothes or show their tattoos. And again, I don't know whether you consider this empathetic or confrontational or both, but just you think about the history and what did Ed live through and what could he tell you and what's your respect for him. And finally, just to close on something a little bit lighter, I think is a wonderful topic in contemporary painting is just kindness, love, sensuality, kindness. And Michelle Dahl does that in her wonderful paintings of couples. It just reminds you of connection and touch, and that the real basis of empathy is that it's a little more of a convenient and abstract form of love, right? A little bit more distance. So those are some images that just kind of enchant me, that deal with empathy in contemporary art. I want to say really, really quickly that the essay about Kathe Kollwitz is in a self-published book that I have. I have some at my house. And then some of the work that you saw today is in this book I have coming out in September called Disrupted Realism. And the theme of the book is that people who, maybe in another generation, would have been painting realistically are adding feeling and subjectivity to their work to tell kind of a different story in what they do. And thank you so much. That's my presentation.